So let's kick things off with a question from the 17th century philosopher Thomas Hobbes. And it's a question we're still wrestling with today. How much of your own personal freedom would you be willing to give up to live a life completely without fear? It's a really tough trade-off, and Hobbes's answer? Well, it was pretty radical, and it was shaped by a world that had been totally plunged into chaos. You've probably heard this line before. It's maybe Hobbes's most famous, and it is just a brutal description of what life can be like. But here's the thing. This isn't his take on everyday life. No, this is a warning. This is the grim reality he believed we would all be staring down if society completely fell apart. So it makes you wonder, what could possibly lead us to that point? Okay, so to really get Hobbes, you have to picture the world he was living in. He wasn't just sitting in an ivory tower thinking this stuff up. He lived through the English Civil War, which was a time of just immense political collapse and violence. He saw with his own eyes what happens when authority just dissolves and a whole nation turns on itself. And, that experience, that trauma, it basically became the engine for his whole philosophy. He set out to find a kind of blueprint, a set of rational principles for building a government so stable that it would be basically immune to civil war. For Hobbes, the horrors he saw were so profound that pretty much any government, even one that was seriously oppressive, was better than that. And this right here, this really gets to the heart of a huge debate about what we're all like deep down. Hobbes's take on us, let's just say it was not exactly optimistic. He saw us as constantly driven by this relentless hunger for more and more power. And that's a world away from his contemporary, John Locke, who thought we're naturally reasonable and equal. This fundamental disagreement is really the jumping-off point for everything else Hobbes argues. So that kind of pessimistic view of people leads straight into his most famous idea, a thought experiment. To build his case for a super powerful government, Hobbes asks us to imagine something. Let's imagine a world with no government. No laws, no police, no courts, nothing. He calls this the state of nature. In this world, you've got total freedom. You have the right to do literally anything you think you need to do to survive. But, and this is a huge but, so does everybody else. So if you and I have a disagreement, there's no one to appeal to. You are your own judge, your own jury, and your own executioner. And where does this all lead? Well, Hobbes says it's inevitable. He argues that three main things push us into conflict. First, we're competing for the same stuff. Second, we're scared that other people will attack us first, so we might as well get them before they get us. And third, we're chasing glory and reputation. In that kind of environment, a war of every man against every man isn't just a risk, it's a dead certainty. And this slide just lays out the brutal, practical results of that. If you're in a constant state of war, civilized life becomes impossible. I mean, think about it. Why would you bother building anything or planting crops if there's no guarantee you'll be around to enjoy it? All the things we value, art, science, business, society itself, they just disappear. All you're left with is continual fear and the constant nagging danger of a violent death. Yeah, it's a pretty terrifying picture, right? But here's the hopeful part. Hobbes thought we're not just driven by our worst impulses. We also have the power of reason. And that reason, he said, gives us an escape route from this nightmare we've created for ourselves, a way out that's based on everyone coming to an agreement. He says our own reason points us toward a set of rules for survival, which he calls the laws of nature. Now, these aren't magical laws handed down from on high. They're just common sense, practical ideas. The number one law is simple. Seek peace. And if you want to boil all of them down to one single idea, it's basically a version of the golden rule. Don't do to others what you wouldn't want them to do to you. So reason gives us this escape plan, and it's basically a three-step process. First, we all have to recognize that peace is in our own best interest. Second, we make a deal, a covenant, to give up our right to do whatever we want. But, a promise is just words. It's totally worthless unless there's someone to make sure everyone sticks to it. And that leads to step 3. We create and authorize one all-powerful ruler, a sovereign, to enforce the deal and keep the peace. And this huge, powerful enforcer, that's what Hobbes famously calls the Leviathan. Yeah, he named it after a giant, terrifying sea monster from the Bible, and believe me, that was on purpose. The name itself is meant to make you think of overwhelming, awe-inspiring power. Now, the key thing for Hobbes is that this sovereign, this Leviathan, has to have absolute power. That means its power can't be divided, and it can't be limited. Its one and only job is to enforce that social contract and do whatever it takes to stop society from sliding back into that chaos he called the state of nature. But why? Why does it have to be absolute? Well, from where Hobbes was standing, he'd seen what happens when you divide power, in his case, between the king and parliament. It just leads to arguments, then conflict, and eventually civil war. He figured that for the system to actually work, there can only be one person or group with the final say. If you start limiting power, you're just inviting people to fight over where those limits are. And the only way to settle that kind of fight is to go to war. And to make this work, the sovereign has to hold all the cards, all the essential powers. And they're all connected. You can't make laws if you don't also have the power to judge people and enforce those laws. You can't have an army if you can't raise taxes to pay for it. And this is the really controversial one. You can't have lasting peace if you let people teach dangerous ideas that might lead to another rebellion. All that power has to be in one place. Okay, so Hobbes is obviously a huge deal, but his philosophy is actually full of these little twists and turns that make him way more than just a simple defender of tyranny. The closer you look, the more complicated he gets. You know, the most common take on Hobbes is that he thought we're all just selfish creatures, deep down. But is that what he really thought? Well, it turns out modern scholars would say probably not. That idea that everything we do is driven only by our own self-interest is called psychological egoism. And today, most people who study Hobbes don't think that's what he was arguing. He knew our motivations are more complicated than that. We also act out of a desire for glory or because of our pride, things that can actually make us act against our own best interests and still wind up causing conflict. And this is where you see a really fascinating tension in his work. On the one hand, he was way ahead of his time, arguing that all people, and he explicitly included women, were naturally equal and free. That was radical for the 17th century. But on the other hand, when he starts describing how society is actually formed, he falls back into the language of his day, talking about families in terms of fathers and servants. It's a major contradiction that shows how even a brilliant thinker can be both ahead of his time and a product of it. And all of this brings us right back to where we started, to that big, timeless question that Hobbes forces us to look at. If the only other option is total chaos, what price would you pay for security? In our world, with debates about surveillance, public safety, and personal freedom, Hobbes's uncomfortable bargain is more relevant than ever. What would you choose?